Welcome back. This is the second video in the series of endocrine videos. The first one was Endocrine 1, and it was about the nervous system versus the endocrine system comparison. This one is Endocrine 2, and it is about random glands. And what this means is these are glands and hormones that are not under the control of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So the control center is not the hypothalamus. So those glands include the thyroid and parathyroid glands, the pineal gland, the pancreas, and one that I forgot to put in here, but I will be talking about, is the adrenal gland. Let's start with the thyroid and parathyroid glands. They are responsible for calcium homeostasis. The thyroid gland will produce a hormone called calcitonin. This calcitonin is going to stimulate osteoblasts and decrease calcium in the blood. The parathyroid gland produces parathyroid hormone, sometimes also called PTH. And it has three different targets. It's going to stimulate osteoclasts to break down bones, but it's also going to target the kidneys in that it is going to cause the kidneys to conserve calcium and not excrete it. And it's also going to target the absorption of calcium and increase it in the intestines. So all these three actions are going to increase calcium levels. So let's draw this out. So say that you have your blood calcium level, which is normal right there. You drink a bunch of milk and the blood calcium level is going to increase. That is your stimulus. The stimulus is going to be picked up by receptors in the thyroid gland. So these are your receptors. And the thyroid gland is also going to make a decision about what to do. So the thyroid gland is not only where the receptors are, it's also the control center. So the thyroid gland is going to make a decision to bring calcium back down, and it's going to produce a hormone called calcitonin. And I always remember calcitonin because it kind of sounds like calcium. So if you have so much calcium that it's overflowing, and it overflows into the name of this hormone. Now remember, the calcitonin is not the effector. The calcitonin is going to trigger the actual effectors, which are the osteoblasts, to build bone and bring calcium levels back down. So the calcitonin are actually the instructions that the thyroid gland sends out. The osteoblasts are the effectors. And then we're going to reduce that stimulus as blood calcium comes down. Now, after a little while, maybe you haven't had anything that has calcium in it for a little while, the blood calcium levels are going to fall. Maybe I'll make this a different color. So blood calcium levels begin to fall. That is a different stimulus. So here calcium was going up, down here calcium is going down. And we actually have different receptors. So the parathyroid glands is going to be where the receptors are housed. So we've got our receptors are different when calcium is too high, receptors, versus when it's too low. And the parathyroid gland is also, just like the thyroid gland up here was both the receptor and the control center, the parathyroid gland is also the receptor and the control center, because we're going to receive the information that calcium is too low, and we're going to send out instructions. And the instructions in this case is a different hormone, parathyroid hormone. I'm just going to write PTH. So remember, these are your instructions, not your effector. Parathyroid hormone is going to act on several different targets. The first target is going to be our osteoclasts. Osteoclasts are going to break down bone and release calcium into the blood. So it's going to increase calcium levels. The second target is going to be the intestine, and it's going to absorb more calcium from the diet and raise blood calcium levels. The third target is going to be the kidney, and it's going to tell the kidney tubules to conserve calcium and not excrete as much of it out of the body. So all these three targets are our effectors. And the reason they're the effectors is they are the ones that are actually changing calcium levels. The parathyroid hormone doesn't change calcium levels. It tells these three effectors to do it. So our next random gland that we're going to talk about is the pancreas. And the pancreas is responsible for glucose homeostasis. But before we start, I want to quickly go through the differences in these three vocabulary words. Glucose is a sugar. It's what we use when we break down sugars to make ATP in cellular respiration. Glycogen is a form of stored glucose. So when we have extra glucose and we want to store it, but just for a little while, maybe not forever, but for a little while, we store it as glycogen. If we're going to store it long term, we generally store excess glucose as fat. Glucagon is a hormone. It's one of the hormones that is produced by the pancreas, and it affects blood glucose levels. Insulin is a hormone that is released when blood glucose levels are too high. And this is going to stimulate the body cells to uptake and store glucose. When we store glucose, we store it as glycogen. Glucagon is that other hormone we were talking about. This is released when blood glucose levels are too low and we want to bring them back up. And this is going to stimulate those body cells to convert glycogen back into glucose and then spit it back out into the bloodstream. So let's draw this out. Say you have your normal blood glucose levels are somewhere here. And as the blood glucose level starts to increase, that is our stimulus. That increase is detected by the beta cells of the pancreas. So the beta cells are our receptors, and those beta cells are also going to make a decision about what to do. So they're not only the receptors, but the beta cells of the pancreas are also the control center. The beta cells of the pancreas are going to release a hormone called insulin, and insulin is going to trigger the effectors to take up glucose and remove it from the blood. And the effectors are going to be our skeletal muscles and liver cells. So the insulin are the instructions, because it doesn't actually change the blood glucose levels. It just tells the skeletal muscles and liver cells to do it. So as they take up glucose and store it away as glycogen, it's going to decrease the glucose levels in the blood. So these guys are our real effectors. As we maybe haven't eaten in a little while and our blood glucose level continues to fall, you're going to have a decrease in your blood glucose levels. Again, any change in a monitored value is a stimulus, and the stimulus is going to act on the alpha cells of the pancreas and cause them to trigger, because they are the receptors for this. The alpha cells of the pancreas are going to produce a hormone called glucagon. And glucagon is going to act on the effectors, which are the skeletal muscles and liver cells. The skeletal muscles and the liver cells are going to convert their stored glucose, remember that's our glycogen, back into glucose and then spit it back out into the bloodstream. And they're going to raise the glucose levels in the blood. So our alpha cells in the pancreas are not only the receptors, they're also the control center. Glucagon, the hormone, is going to be our instructions, and our liver cells and our skeletal muscle cells are going to be our effectors. So we have a little bit of a different situation here. Remember, in calcium homeostasis, we had two different stimuli, either high or low calcium, two different control centers and receptors, and we had two different hormones, and we had a bunch of different effectors. This system is a lot simpler in that we have two different stimuli, and we have two different receptors, two different control centers, and two different hormones, but our effectors are the same. So whether they're taking up glucose and taking it out of the blood, or they're converting glycogen back into glucose and putting it back into the blood, it's still the same effectors. And depending on which hormone you use, it'll tell them to do those different things. Now, whenever we talk about blood glucose level, it always brings us to a discussion on diabetes mellitus. And this is a special type of diabetes that has to do with an inability of the body to maintain their blood glucose levels. Here we have our homeostasis loop for glucose. There's two different types of diabetes mellitus. Type 1 is usually some type of genetic or hereditary type, and it basically means that the body does not produce sufficient insulin. For this homeostatic loop, this part right here doesn't work properly. So you can have lots of high blood glucose. You can detect that there's something going on. The pancreas can make a decision, but the actual instructions get lost. And so those body cells cannot uptake the glucose. The glucose stays very, very high in the blood. So the symptoms of this are high blood glucose, which the body tries to get rid of by excreting in the urine. So you have high glucose in the urine. And because the body cells can't get any glucose to make ATP, they're literally starving. So they start to break down other things. So they start to break down proteins and fats within themselves. And so people that have type 1 diabetes tend to be quite thin because they're literally starving. They can't get enough, they can't use the glucose that's in their body to feed their cells. Type 2 diabetes is quite a bit different. Instead of having no insulin, what happens is that tend to be overweight and tend to have high levels of blood sugar all the time because they're eating a lot, and high level of insulin all the time. So it's not that they don't produce insulin. The problem is that this feedback loop is happening so often that this part starts to not happen. So it's a disease of insulin resistance. The body cells have been inundated with insulin all the time because we're constantly got high blood sugar, that the insulin no longer has an effect. The body cells essentially just ignore it. So all of that excess glucose that's in the blood also causes high glucose in the urine, but these people tend to be overweight, and a lot of that blood sugar gets stored as fat, so they become even more overweight. And both of these types of diabetes cause all kind of blood vessel problems. So you can end up with ulcers on the feet because your circulation isn't good. You can end up with vision problems because the small blood vessels of the eyes break and tear, and all kinds of other issues. The next gland is the pineal gland, and this is responsible for your sleep-wake cycle. So we have photoreceptors in the eyes. All right, I know it's not great. So here's the light coming in, and it stimulates photoreceptors in the eye when the light starts to go down. So as the sun is setting, it serves as a stimulus to the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus tells the pineal gland to secrete a hormone called melatonin. And melatonin makes us sleepy. So the reason that you feel so sleepy in the winter is because it gets dark so early. Now, one way to circumvent this is you trick the photoreceptors in the eye. So you start looking at your iPhone or your computer or your TV, and all of that blue light that is hitting the eye is going to tell the hypothalamus that it's not time to go to bed. And it's actually going to cause destruction of the melatonin. So if you are having trouble going to sleep or you're not feeling sleepy at night, a lot of times the problem is your little iPhone. So that blue light is going to disrupt this system and make it so that you're not sleepy. The last gland we're going to talk about in this video is the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands sit like little hats on the top of each of your kidneys. The adrenal gland has two areas. It's got the cortex, which is the outer part, and it's got the medulla, which is sort of the inside part of it. So the part we're going to talk about right now is the medulla. On the next video, we're going to talk about the cortex. But this is kind of a weird gland because it is actually under neural control, which means that the nervous system is going to have neurons that reach out and actually directly stimulate the adrenal medulla. And it's going to cause the production of two hormones. Now, these hormones, when we talk about them in the nervous system, we call them neurotransmitters. But because the adrenal medulla is going to release them into the blood, they're called hormones. Remember, endocrine system hormones are released into the blood. So we have norepinephrine and epinephrine. Epinephrine is also known as adrenaline, and both of these hormones are going to upregulate your sympathetic response or your fight or flight reflexes. This is also known as your autonomic nervous system. So even though the stimulation is coming directly from the nervous system by a neuron, the hormones are released into the blood and they're going to upregulate all the things that you need in a fight or flight response. That's it for today. Come on back for the next video, which is going to be on the adrenal cortex and aldosterone.